thanks for humoring me. I wanted us to sit like we're sitting on a table, because it's, so much life happens on the table. You kind of meet for ritual, you meet for celebrations, activities, and everything like this. So I thought it would be a nice way for us to sit, be a little bit more intimate. Also, later on in the day, we'll get stuck in and experiment with some fermentation. So I think it will make more sense if we're sitting. Cool. So the workshop today is called Recipes, Resilience, and Regeneration. So just to contextualize this within the class theme, yesterday we talked about care instructions and cultural heritage. I liked what Tessa said about instructions in terms of what you've actually been told to do, how you've been told to do something. And what I'd like us to think about a little bit together today is why. Yeah? What is the purpose of that? Does it still serve us as human beings? Is it something that we need to adopt or adapt? And then culture, also Tessa brought up a nice aspect with that today, where yesterday, where she spoke about the two elements, the material and the process. And I think that the reason that both Patrick and I, and generally will probably a lot of us end up thinking about food, is because it marries all of these different aspects of cultural heritage, instructions, passing over, lineage, knowledge transfer, and all of this. So why I chose to look at recipes was because recipes are like traditional care instructions of how to cook something. They're an intangible heritage and knowledge transmission. So how recipes used to exist when we had what actually was more diverse, separate food cultures. Because remember yesterday Patrick was talking about how areas that have more separation have more diversity within them. The more we kind of mix and we blend, we kind of lose that diversity to a bigger, wider culture. So what I find interesting is that recipes used to be passed down within smaller communities, so families, villages, small communities within localized areas. And now, you just go on YouTube, you want to cook something from any country in the world, and boom, you've got instructions. So it's a different life. And the main thing I really want to focus on in terms of us thinking relationally about how we interact with food and using that to think a bit more broadly about how we interact with nature is the concept of resilience. So yesterday Patrick was speaking about wild food species, and we looked at that chart which looked at cabbage and looked at the spider plants and the different amounts of iron and folate which were inside those plants, and basically there was no competition. So what I find really fascinating about resilience is resilience feels like complex systems that support each other mutually. And resilience works when, a monoculture is the opposite of resilience. What you've done is removed all of the diversity from that farming system, and you've introduced monotony, and from that comes sensitivity, and you're very open for anything to come and destabilize that structure. Okay? So looking at resilience as complex systems of nodes and strands, food cultures as keeping species and practices alive, and the resilience of wild and uncultivated foods. So an interesting thing is actually when I had my first child and when I was breastfeeding, I was advised by a friend of mine's grandmother in Zanzibar to eat as much wild food as possible. She said, eat as many different diverse types of food that you can confirm are food. Don't go too crazy. Because inside the genetic material of that plant is resilience. Yeah, this plant has managed to find its way into a wild environment, continue to grow, continue to spread its seed, and for that it's very resilient. If we're to compare that to a cultivated plant, especially one which is dependent on chemical fertilizers, we can actually look at the independence of the genetic material of that life. So when I was breastfeeding, I was taking a lot of wild foods, and maybe that's why my son is also wild. And then I also want us to focus a little bit about regeneration, because what's fascinating about nature is that the systems that are already in place are systems of regeneration and abundance. Yeah, if you look at the way everything grows. You can't even farm all those seeds. It's just insane. It's like this multiplication, diversification, and what we've done is we've come in and we've said, actually, all of this abundance, we need to control this for our needs and the things that we want, the work that we don't want to do, and so we've kind of, after years and years of having a positive relationship, absorbing the abundance of nature and being a part of that process, we started to implement control in the form of farming. And actually the common conception is that farmers are the people who are kind of closest to the earth, most embedded in the cycles of the earth, and I think that at one stage that was true, but now farmers are dependent on really difficult systems of control and management. And so what I want you to think about over the course of this workshop is the relationship that you have with food. There are also some sticky notes all over the table, and I was thinking if you have a question either for me or for someone else or for yourself, or that you would like to ask Google later, just write it on the sticky notes and put them on the table, and then I think it would be nice for us to have a look at them at some point in the workshop. Okay? So to think about that relationship, the relationship you have with food, the relationship you have with soil, and how that kind of creates a wider understanding of your relationship in the world. Yeah? Okay, I would really love to start by maybe whoever feels like sharing their food memory that came up.
My food memory? My late grandma used to make this really nice dish, and I think, so I've been trying to find the plant, and we talked about it yesterday, and I'm like, oh, so I'm not crazy, it actually existed. Because I thought it was maybe a fabrication of my mind. Mm-hmm. But yeah, my memory is me going back home, and my grandma is in the garden picking leaves, and then she cooks them, and I get to eat that meal. It was really nice.
We used to go to the village every December holidays, and then after Christmas our parents would leave us there so that we engage with our aunties and grandma. And the memory that stood out mostly, because my mind kept on going to all the different parts, but then there's this one time when we were in had finished harvesting. I don't really remember so well. And then there were potatoes on the side, so we made this heap of a mound of earth, and they put the stems and leaves of the corn, maize or what's needed, and then we let it burn the whole time. It was like the evening time, and then when we were going back home around 6, we removed the potatoes, and it was amazing because we start around for a bit, and then it really got so late because in the village by 7, 6:40, there's no light or something. Yeah, but it's that's
Hey. So I went to boarding school quite early. I went to P1. But that's because my big sister was with me, and I wanted to go with them, so I went. But when we reached that, they told us no food and stuff. Okay, no snacks, grab. And we reached that, kids had groundnuts, they had corn, they had soya, they had all these things. We were like, what? I thought this was illegal. So the next time, we go home and tell our mom, and then we started a culture of making our ground at home. So we basically do everything from scratch. Just the maize seeds, boil them, grind them, fry them, and even do it ourselves, the groundnuts, and then take to the machine to make tea. Even the groundnuts for packing, making the daddies, but just it's yesterday when we were talking about all these grains and seeds, I think back to how even with little things like gram, we actually had quite the diversity with food.
And also like that joy of communally preparing it, right?
Yeah.
Just kind of disappearing.
It is.
Yeah.
Because my little sister would just buy or
Just go to the shop. Just take up. Yeah.
So when I was young, we used to live in Zambia. So I was born close to Zambia. It was like my first area I witnessed when I was a kid. And then in 2000, I think it was 2003, we got a space in Leche, where we resided for over 20 years. So when we got to this place, I recall electricity wasn't installed in the house. And there was this time around when we were bored. Me, my dad, and my mom. I was the only son then. My mom had prepared food, which I don't recall what that was. And then after eating the food, we were playing draft that my dad created out of beer bottles. Beer bottles. And my mom went on to prepare eggs, just as an afterserve. And I told my dad, it was like we had a bonding time then, because I wasn't like way open with my dad and all that. But this time when I told him, if I win this game, I'm eating your eggs. And we went on head to head. I don't know if he chose to let me win, but I won, yes, and he win. And I ate his eggs, and I think that was like the evolution between around our relationship. Because earlier on, my dad used to do a lot of safaris and all that, but then I wasn't even asking my mom, oh, how is he, But then after that, things changed. I could talk to him. I was young. He had tried a lot of things, taking me for football. I used to play natural blue clothes here, and I wasn't feeling football till then. He used to take me like even to theaters to watch football. I wasn't like in
It will be football.
Yes, but then with the chess, because actually that's where my games, because I like games a lot. So I've been practicing in Scrabble, draft, and just that's where it started. So it's how we created a bond. I feel like that was a part. My initiation into games and my initiation into the relationship with my dad.
That's amazing. I challenge you to make a board game, which is basically just eating.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have a memory that they want to share?
Well, mine is one, my sister taking a beer at about 1 year. Yeah, well, one of my aunties had left a bottle lying around, and she did, and then we see a child coming out staggering. So that was that. And then we lived in a community where they would make malwa, so we would always go and steal there's a way they make it, and they're bowls that are rolled and first put out to dry, so we'd go and steal those. Steal those and then eat those. Yeah, so it's basically around alcohol. Yeah, because it was either malwa or kwete, which our parents would still give us to try when we were young. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, like, food memories are really evocative. Sometimes I catch a whiff of something and I'm like transported to, what does this why does it remind me of something? Like, never I'm able to pinpoint it, but the smell is trying to take me somewhere. So I like the idea that we all have these kind of embedded memories that form the bond that we now have with food. Of course, we live in a modern world. We have deadlines to meet. bodas to catch, and sometimes you don't have enough time to go and thresh your own beans and XYZ. But I think what I want to talk about a bit today is that there are a lot of new developments in terms of how people are interfacing food and also land tenure, which is super exciting, and there are a lot of opportunities also within cities to get involved in having a better relationship. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so I know that we're talking about cultural heritage in a more general form, but I wanted to just focus in a little bit about food cultures, because basically a food culture is like beliefs, attitudes, and practices related to how you produce and consume food. And those are the two separate things there. How do we produce the food, and how do we consume it? And how these two things obviously ultimately influence each other. For many people, eating the food we enjoyed as children transports us back into our childhood, senses of nostalgia, comfort, belonging, self-identification. Communal eating, and there's been actually quite a lot of research that is being done on this these days, boosts a sense of community, a sense of feeling like a part of something bigger than yourself, well-being, and helps us to feel alive, vibrant, and together. Next slide, please. So the Western diet culture, as Patrick was talking about yesterday, turned food into something that is weighed and measured rather than valued and enjoyed. Yeah, it's now this trading commodity that we think about in almost strictly numerical terms in the preparation, the sale of the food, and everything like this. When you interface with subsistence farmers, yeah, okay, I have a big harvest, or I have too much of this, I have to share it with someone else, or this is in season now, so I can enjoy this now. If not, we'll trade, and then you can grow this, I can grow this, and it's more of a form of relationship than it is a commodity. And our mental and physical health as a culture are starting to suffer because of this relationship. We want food to be grown as big and as uniform as possible. We want it to look pretty much the same. We want it to be predictable in its taste. And this is removing the diversity from our soil, removing the diversity from our diets, and as we spoke about yesterday, also making us sick. So what's important is taking time to reconnect with food systems, experimenting with cooking from scratch. My youngest sister, she's like, fast food takeout queen, and recently she got really into baking bread, and she's like a whole new person. And another really important element is, sharing food with others. You'll find if you start growing food, or if you're really interested in making food and you meet other people who are also doing that, these people want to feed you and share all the time. You will always end up meeting for a meal, or they'll give you something that they just farmed, or you'll exchange some seeds, and it's a really, really positive community. Okay, next slide. Okay, so why food? Food is the evocative force that connects us with our food webs, our cultural heritage, our traditions, and ourselves. Eating is a way of engaging with the living world, with bacteria, with fungi, with plants, your community, and beyond. Food provides more than just nourishment. It explores what we consume, how we prepare it, and the people that we share it with. We spoke here about industrial agriculture and climate change because this is important when we understand our relationship with nature. So if we're to stop for a moment and think about soil, for example. Soil is a really big part of our cultural heritage. I live in Zanzibar. There are very few places that actually have soil on the island because it's an archipelago. There's a lot of rock and sand. It's actually very difficult to grow vegetables there. Fruit trees are doing very well. But veggies, it's a real struggle. And whenever I'm thinking about my self-identification as a Ugandan, I think about the soil. I think about, we come from this really fertile land where you can grow X, Y, Z, and naturally I'm always boasting about this. So yeah, the vast majority of people these days are actually completely dependent on a really fragile, complex global system of trade, transport, chemicals, movement, and ultimately also disease. So sharing skills, resources, and information related to the production and consumption of food as an art rather than as a commodity, I think is what we want to focus on today. And the reason I wanted to talk to you a bit about fermentation, and there's a really great book here called The Art of Fermentation. I won't be offended if you want to open any of these books while we're doing the workshop, which talks about, engaging with the ingredients that you're making when you're fermenting something as being an act of freedom and independence. Yeah, because you take away your dependence on, say, for example, probiotic supplements or additional nutrients that you're trying to take in the form of a capsule, and you're just making your own medicine by thinking about how you process this food. It's also thinking about how you preserve this food. So you're usually working with seasonal ingredients, or you're working with a surplus of ingredients. All right, next slide. Okay, so I wanted to talk just a little bit about how this relationship that we have as a collective evolved. So initially we were hunter-gatherers. We used to go into the wild. We developed a really intricate knowledge of what plants were edible, which plants were not. And I think it's also worth noting that that knowledge took years to cultivate, and it's being lost so fast that I'm not sure if the modern day human is really going to go and taste and experiment with all of these new plants, with old plants, and figure out whether or not they're edible, because now we've developed a real fear for things that are wild. Yeah? So we used to use controlled fire, intricate knowledge of plant life and evolution, of tools, and I think that this is also really important, because us needing to find food meant that we had to start making creative solutions around how to get that food. So, okay, I've got some stones, there's an animal, if I sharpen this stone, then I can have a better chance of getting that animal, right? And so it's like, because of this need to eat, we started to work with the materials that we have and the world around us to create our initial tools. And then there's an interesting point that I wanted to make here, which I read in a book recently about psilocybin and consciousness. There's some really interesting theories about humans evolving alongside psychedelic mushrooms, because there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that we've been using them for a really long time. And some people think that the reason that the human brain grew and developed and became aware as much as it did was because we interacted with psychedelics a long time ago. So I think that that's also a really interesting theory just to think about. So then came agriculture, then came this, cultivation of the environment. And this took a really long time, because we were trying to organize livestock and figuring out how to keep animals, and they were making us sick. And agriculture as a set of systems was different in all of the places that it was starting. I think that initially it was in Mesopotamia, and then and it took a really long time to put those systems in place. But what that kind of did to our brains was make us start thinking about, there are seasons. There are some times when this is growing, and other times when these things are mating, and other times when this is pollinating, and to start to really pay attention to the natural processes that are happening in nature. And essentially everything in nature is a natural process of growth and decay. You cannot run from it. The same with, humans. We are born, we live, we grow, we start to decline, and we die. And every single, when you interact with a seed, a tree, a piece of food, so even if you think about nowadays, people are harvesting something called microgreens, and they're the sprouts of a food, like the young babies of maybe a lettuce or an alfalfa or a wheat or something like this, because they're really nutrient dense. So we kind of eat food at all different stages in the life chain. Yeah. And then we moved into, when the Green Revolution started happening, industrial agriculture. And this is when we realized, you know what? We can feed the world. We just need to change some elements. And like with most of human developments, we were really trying to do a good thing. But also really ignoring the systems that were already in place. Yeah, and cut to today, and we understand what that looks like in the present moment. So one of the keys to our well-being is the well-being of the microflora with whom we share these bodies and with whom we co-evolve. So something that's super interesting is that there's 4 major groups of bacteria that can be found within your digestive system, and they're the same 4 major groups of bacteria that can be found within the soil. And so I think that's a really nice thing to reflect on when we reflect on ourselves being a part of nature and being composed of all of the same elements. Next slide, please. So I wanted to tell you a story about Minabulitwa, which is a small lake in Kabarole. There's a small section of indigenous forest with amazing diversity. It's on a steep slope like this in an area with a lot of rain, and it's pretty undisturbed, so the soil is very fertile. And one day, the story is that a lady who was fishing had an avocado, and she went to go and eat the avocado at the top of the tree, at the top of the hill. And she was just having her lunch and obviously discarded of the seeds and continued with her life. And now when you go to this section of the forest, there's like a section which is strictly avocados. There's like an avocado forest there. So what happened was that she ate the avocado at the top of the hill, the seed rolled down, and every tree that grew after that, their seeds also rolled down. And it created this avocado forest. And you can find people now there bathing in avocado season with the avocados, giving themselves a face mask, putting it in their hair, and I just think to myself, what a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So humans, we are essentially part of nature. We are just like a leaf or a fruit or a decomposing piece of wood that fell off of a tree. We are nature. We have a lot of systems in place that make us feel like we are above and outside of nature, but we are made up of all of the same genetic material. So I wanted to ask you guys what you feel about that. Do you feel embedded in your natural environment? Do you feel like you come from your natural environment? Do you feel like when you spend time in nature that you're extracting yourself from a world and taking yourself to another one? Because I have a friend who says, okay, I've got to go and just gotta go and be in nature. And I'm like, but so I wanted to ask you about how you feel about your personal relationship with the natural environment and with nature. If nothing comes to mind, you can also write it down.
Yeah, I think for me it was actually one of the reasons why I moved to Uganda, because in Germany, in Berlin, I felt so disconnected from nature all the time. Even things like, when there was a full moon, I could sense it in the body, but I couldn't see it from my window. So there I had to go for walks sometimes, 15 minutes to see the shape of the moon. And yeah, for me it's one of the reasons why I'm here. Because I feel like here it's impossible not to be connected, even in Kampala, to nature at all. And another thing for me is also, in the beginning, it was very frustrating sometimes in terms of resources here. Because in Europe you're so used that you just can go, it takes you 2 minutes to go to a supermarket, you can get everything you want. But after time, I realized also the benefits of not being able to access all of that so quickly. Because here then I started cooking from scratch more, or I started finding people who produce the cheese that I couldn't find in the supermarket, or other things like honey and so on. And for me, that's a big gift. Yeah.
And it's growing your food community, and you're a part of the food culture instead of just being the person who goes to the supermarket and goes home.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So I have a question, and just share basic answers. How many of you walk outside barefoot?
Great
We've
point.
never had a more like volunteering experience, and when you realize you are free, and when you step with your bare feet on the ground, you kind of feel everything. So same with the sun. I love the sun. So with the sun, it feels strange when the sun gets between your toes. It's not unpleasant, and it's not the most pleasing thing. So even when you step on a stone and you're like, oh, that I wasn't expecting that alone saves an interaction with nature, and also it reminds you that you are of
So first and foremost, when you told us to close our eyes, I experienced something. Like I had that bad chap. I had some noise. I don't recall what that was. And when we opened our eyes, I did hear that tap again. And it showed me that it's not all about what you see, it's about what you feel. With the environment, you tend to experience new things when we go to new places, and that's because first we have an interface with them, and two, there is the excitement in you to experience what you want to experience when you're in that area. It's like when the first image I took today was this. I might have seen it somewhere else, but it looks different here. And there is that connection between us and whatsoever is on the other side. There is a connection. They don't speak, but you feel they say something. And I think we tend to close out on that. You move across a tree that you meet on a daily, just because you see it, like, oh, it's an avocado tree.
Yeah.
Until someone tells you.
Well, you probably only notice it when it's fruiting, right?
Yes, yes, that's when it's necessary to you.
Yeah.
So I feel the urge to, for all of us to take care of ourselves. I think when we take care of the trees, the nature in that sense, they also take care of us. Like they create connections around us. I think, yeah, that's the point. After that Mina Litwa, I saw that coexistence of people and forest.
For sure.
Yeah.
I am used to do urban sketchings, do sketching outside, and I have a chance to observe many things happening around me, which people don't notice in a normal time. And I started to live in Goma and Gisenyi since last year, and they are built near the Lake Kivu. So sometimes I like to spend time putting my feet inside of the lake. I have this, I don't know how to explain it, but there is something happening every time when I do that with the lake. I said maybe somewhere I'm connected with that lake, but I don't know how. But yeah, it feels like interesting to put my feet inside and stay there maybe 1 hour, 2 hours.
Nice if you don't have to really rationalize it, it's just a feeling, right? It comes up and you're like, let me do it, it feels good, it feels natural.
And I like it.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
I have actually one to share because I think, so I was raised in Uganda, but in Kampala. The old Kampala, which was very green. And my father is a Muganda, but his mom is also partially from Rwanda. My mother was British, but her mother was Mexican American and her father was British French. And you know, they actually met in the UK and decided, you know, let's move. We want our kids to grow up outside. Let's move to Uganda. And a lot of my memories as a child were outside in the garden, doing like just being in a mess all the time, playing with dirt, things that we're afraid to let our children do now. And then, you know, I guess, you know, life happens and you become an adolescent, you move on, you go and do your things and you study. And I remember being in the UK in university learning about post-colonial East Africa and being like, I don't know anything about my culture. Why am I learning this in England? And it was like blasphemy. I was so annoyed. Because what we laugh about with my siblings now is my father was in this generation of, you know, wanting to assimilate to Britishness, and you know, he ended up there as a refugee, and I can understand his perspective, and he thought, you know, I want you guys to speak good English and all of this, and And my mom really hated Britishness, and she wanted to be a Muganda. And so we kind of grew up in this crossfire of not really knowing what's going on. And so as we become adults, all of my siblings and I, we kind of get to know ourselves and our new forms of identity in our own different ways. And for me, this really came to life when I started farming. Because something pulled me back to Uganda. I was similarly not enjoying the construct of life, and I really always had these positive memories in the garden, and also started doing a bit of community agriculture in the UK. And I thought to myself, it would be much nicer to farm when it's not winter or autumn. Eventually moved back to Uganda and started living on a farm around this lake, Minabulitwa. And I was living there in a tent for almost 3 years, living in the farm, working the soil, saving seeds, learning about the indigenous plants, and just getting to know how to work the land. By our second year on the farm, everything we were eating, we were growing. We were making our own flour, we were growing our own vegetables. It was a really amazing experience, which taught me, first of all, how cooperative the environment is once you choose to interact with it in such a way that you're thinking about the long term, not just thinking about what you can get out of it. It also taught me that culture doesn't necessarily have to be, language or dance or dress. It can also be your relationship with the soil and the flora and fauna around you. And this was when I really started to feel like a part of the natural living system. And then, when I got really into the garden and really into keeping my nursery, I think my favorite stage in the life cycle is germination. You plant this seed and then you have this little It's really, every time, it's such a special thing. And so we had a really extensive nursery with lots of different types of plants, and I was bringing them to Kampala and giving all my friends and planting in their gardens and things like this. And I remember one day I had a dream, and the dream was that my radish were about to germinate. And then another time I had a dream that my beans were going to be ready. And every time these dreams happened on the same day that happened.
Wow.
So I found this amazing. I started to think, wow, this is me actually being embedded in the cycle. Me understanding how long things take and starting to really feel that on an intrinsic level. Okay, next slide. So it's all about perspective. This is an album cover that I helped design for my friend. And the name of the album is Sidam Chalo. Who knows what that means?
Going back to the village.
Going. So I found this really a fun project to work on because at the time I was actually living in Fort Portal. I wasn't on my farm yet, but I was at another friend's farm. And the whole energy around the music video was like, yeah, I made it to the city, I'm not going back to the village. And I was like, I'm loving the village. And I wanted to ask you, I found it really interesting also, the two projects that came up for me was the one about work and song through song, labor, and how we use the body as an instrument to make work lighter. And then there was also this notion of punishment. Because so many of my friends who grew up in the village, like to now go and return to having to do that work is like a punishment, It's like going backwards in time, or why would I need to get my hands dirty when I can type, and, like things like this. So I wanted to ask you, what is your perspective on farming, being in a slightly less urbanized environment or interacting with the food that you grow? What is your perspective on returning to the village?
Personally, I've shared this with my friends that have been told it's Ethiopian. I desire to still make like 5 acres of this land, and I have this house made out of materials like this, like where we are right now, and with lake view nearby. So generally describing like what you're doing right now. Yeah, so my relationship with family right now is it's something that I cherish, but because of the lack that I have experienced in the urban setting, I guess, like I had an interesting experience, even mental health, and I'm like, yeah, don't shoot me, but yeah, I'm very reserved when it comes to like mental health medicine. Yeah, so I was always like on this ride of, and I think when you said so many TED talks, because at first it was fitness, and I'm like, okay, what do the mental health drugs do? Okay, so you're saying they give me like dopamine and serotonin. Okay, so I had someone talk about how fitness like helps in that. So I'm like, okay, I'm just like running, I'm just like skipping. Like I can do this without the medicine. So we reach a point, and I think that hits the road. Yeah, so that's when I start to explore like what's different, because I constantly have this conversation with my housemate about why do we seem fragile as a generation. This is quote unquote. Yeah, why do we come off as fragile and everything? So we're like, what if maybe it's because we're on the same side and everything? So it kinda, I'm always like trying and erroring. So I'm like, you know what? Maybe I need to, because now we were now introspecting like the resilience our parents had, and how they came to the urban cities and still survived the harsh conditions. So when you talked about like eating the foods in the wild, I was like, oh, well, maybe that could be one of the answers. And I'm excited to share that with her. So that's when I'm like, I'm going to try and reconnect with nature. So I start to like grow plants, and of course like a new plant person, and then like I immerse myself in the experience of the earth, like when you're trying to change the soil of the roots, and then sometimes one plant will die and the super side, and then yeah, so and now I've also been looking into how do I start to eat my own food, but like I'm in the urban setting. Yeah, I think it was last week when I first harvested like the first mint leaves from my plant, and I was so excited. So for me, my relationship with family is that I suspect that maybe this is where it starts, that maybe we are supposed to be part of this process, but also in terms of as a country, because like 85% of our land is arable, like it's fertile, and most of us, 70% is employed in that sector. I'm always thinking that if maybe we figured out how to make this better, better not necessarily in like the green revolution kind of way, but rather maybe irrigation and teaching people how to really benefit from this, then we could be that place that is able to benefit from the farming and yet still give the benefits of like being I always think about, I know it's like influenced by TV, but every time I think about Texas, like I see big farms and cows and lambs, and they seem to, again, this is informed by what I watch. I don't know what's really there. They seem to have, again, but I suspect it might have actually what I'm trying to say, because they have like these big farms that they have, and their kids go there and everything. We hear kids who are like leaving for the first time. So yeah, that's my relationship with farming and plants and the soil.
But there's nowadays it's actually really fascinating because there's a lot of research being done on farming because our soils are getting depleted. Yeah, like, and this type of farm that you describe is usually, managed by one or two people, a bunch of machinery, some pretty heavy chemicals, and in the States there's actually more and more people who are buying up plots of land in the middle of, say, an area which only farms wheat and making regenerative demonstration gardens, because the care instructions that have been coming to us about farming have changed a lot in the last 50, 60 years. And it's all focusing on this concept of yield. And yield is how much can you get from one crop, in terms of weight and number of fruit and things like this. How tightly together can you plant those crops to maximize the potential of that land. But what we don't think about when we think about yield is how many other species feed from that crop or interact with that crop, or we don't think about how the soil is going to do after that growing season, how all of the biodiversity in the soil are going to be affected by how we're choosing to either spray it or till it and things like this. And even, nowadays there's a lot of people who are proposing that we should do something called no-till agriculture, which is just keep the carbon in the soil. Don't dig everything up and make mounds, and because actually what's underneath this perfect cushy carpet that separates us from the rock beneath us and the air above us is a lot of life and a lot of biodiversity, which is intrinsically intelligent. It understands its surroundings, it understands what it needs to do. So there's a lot of research nowadays in the form of regenerative agriculture, which is people who want to make systems of growing food that create more continuity, create more diversity, make food for more different types of species, which recycle the waste that comes from that crop when you grow it. And I like this because it's a whole systems approach, like nature. That makes more sense.
That's true.
Okay, next slide. Does anyone enjoy work of the kitchen or work of the garden? Garden. Kitchen, hands up. Half. And garden? That's really good. Usually you get 2 people. I remember watching my grandmother working in the garden when I was a kid, and I thought, that looks like the most boring thing in the world. And now it's all I want to do. Next slide. Okay, so fermentation. I want to move, sorry, I know we're dancing around because the topics all go like this, so it's difficult to keep everything straight arrow. The reason I want to talk to you about fermentation today was because, like farming, fermentation introduced me to another way of interacting with my food culture. It's a cross between the arts and the sciences. It's fascinating, and we're going to try it together today. So after this long conversation about cabbage being basically useless yesterday, I brought some cabbage. Just for ease of workshop purposes. It's the easiest ferment we can all do together. We'll do it at the end of the slideshow, but we're going to make something called sauerkraut. Fermentation is amazing. Both gardening and fermentation, probably also cooking, they encourage you to zoom in and pay attention to small details, which are obviously part of a much bigger world. But the fact that you're zooming in and interacting with that material and watching it grow and change means that you are growing and changing also. So the same thing like with knowing when my plants were going to germinate. When I was pregnant was when I first started fermenting. First started with lockdown because we had ample time. And then my husband and I had tried to get back to Uganda. We ended up in Zanzibar. We had a baby on the way. We were like, let's set up a business. Bada bing, bada boom. Now we have a fermentation business. And what we actually did was we just tried a few farmers markets to see if anybody might need these kind of products. And every single time we went to the farmer's market, we sold everything. And we were like, oh, also because, on an island like Zanzibar, it's really difficult to know, first of all, what's indigenous. It's really difficult to know where all the food is coming from because so many things are imported. Actually, 25% of things that are grown on Zanzibar are wasted in post-harvest handling, and I think that number is probably more like 50. So actually, to acquire fish is great, fruits is great, vegetables, absolute disaster. So we started to think about some recipes that we can put together, because what's nice about fermentation is that it's adding value, not just nutritional value, but also if you're the person who makes it, if you're going to sell one piece of cabbage or if you're going to sell a jar of fermented cabbage, the margin is very different. Yeah. So we started playing around with fermentation, and then I started to have these dreams of, okay, the ferment is ready. Wake up, go and taste it, and it's ready. So it's another thing that embeds you into that food culture and process. So, what do you guys know about fermentation? Anybody have a experience with kombucha?
Yeah.
Sure.
Same.
Yeah?
Oh yeah, sure.
You make it at home?
Yeah. And then you let it ferment over a
Yeah.
few days,
Yeah.
but you can keep drinking it.
How long does yours take to ferment?
Should be about 2 to 3 days, and then you can drink. Kombucha that I've kept for over a year. It just keeps growing, and I just keep adding.
That's what it does.
Amazing, yeah.
Once you start, you're like, anybody need a scoop?
Right? Right? Do you
Yeah.
want to scoop it? Yeah, it's just interesting.
Abundant thing. Boucher, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, so kombucha, boucher. Anybody else have any experience with fermented foods or
Malwa.
Love the alcohol story. So, we'll go to a long list of fermented foods because there's a lot of fermented food in the culture. This global food system that we now exist in, there's a lot of products that used to be fermented which are now, mixed with MSG or pasteurized for shelf life and things like this, but there's still a lot of things that sometimes you don't even know that fermentation occurred in the producing of that food type. So just on a kind of to define fermentation, in case there's any confusion, it's a metabolic process that produces chemical changes in organic substances through action of enzymes. In biochemistry, it's broadly defined as the extraction of energy from carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen. So fermentation came up as a need to preserve food and as a creative solution for food surpluses. For places that have 4 seasons and only one growing season, you can't just have vegetables for 3 months in the year. You need to find some kind of a way to keep them fresh for longer, add more nutrients to them, add more benefits. And I think that a lot of the practices around fermentation, they came from that need, right? To have those nutrients, to make sure that you have that diversity in your diet and to try and prolong the time that you can do that. Nowadays we do this with additives and lots of other things, but I think the initial refrigerator, the initial preservative was fermentation. The word culture actually comes up in fermentation a lot, and we'll go through that in the next slide. There's many layers of the meaning of the word culture embedded within the discussion around fermentation. And then there's living food. So what fermentation is you're taking bacteria and yeast, you're mixing them with the specific types of ingredients. Your most important things to consider are the environment that you create. You only let good bacteria in, so you make sure that everything that you're working with is clean. And then it's all about time and temperature, because every place will have different wild yeast in the atmosphere. Every single place will have, different levels of humidity, heat. For example, in Zanzibar, when we make something which is called a ginger bug, which is the starter for making ginger beer, a lot of countries in the world this process takes about 12 days, but because it's just so insufferably hot in Zanzibar, it takes 2, so everything is moving much faster. And then, we'll go through some examples and talk about global and local food. So fermentation is an ancient ritual that humans have been performing over millennia through observation of natural phenomena and collaborating with other living beings. Those living beings are not insects or animals, they're microbes. You can't see them. And it's still a relational thing. Today's modern world, fear of bacteria means that we collectively understand these processes as something that happens in a lab or under factory conditions. And fermentation has almost disappeared from our households and communities. This is not true of everywhere. Many places have a really strong food culture around fermentation.
Oh yeah,
Injera, for example. What I find really interesting when I'm trying to do the marketing for our company, because I see that a lot of fermentation businesses, because it's an interesting topic, they like to do, behind the scenes posts on Instagram. This is us happily fermenting something. If we post something like that, it does not get any love. People want to know that we produce things in a factory with gloves, and that it's a really rigid and controlled environment. And this might be because our market is different. Say, for example, the companies I'm comparing us to, they're operating in. One of them is in the UK, one of them is in South Africa, and I think that they're kind of fed up of this industrialized food system, and they want craft food. They want to know that a hand touched that thing, or that it was made with some element of love. Whereby in our market now we're like, oh, but was it controlled? Did everybody do it right? And am I sure I can trust this? So it's just different perspectives on what this living food really means. Next slide. So, this was how we were just talking about the need, and that many creative endeavors are born by a contextually specific need of people or place in a certain time. So I wanted to invite you to think creatively about the needs that we will be presented with in the future as our climate starts to change. And how would that alter food preparation processes? How would that alter the way we define traditional recipes or traditional food? Say, for example, if the temperature in certain areas is going to change by 1 or 2 degrees, that's going to ultimately affect whether or not we can grow certain types of crops. Already all over the world, wheat is being farmed in areas that are cooler than it used to be before. So there's going to be those kind of adaptive processes in our food culture that we also need to consider. The picture that I put over here is just something that's too cool. So when you're fermenting a starter, the yeast are going to eat up the sugars, and they're going to create ethanol and carbon dioxide. And this is going to happen. What's nice about it is all neatly in a jar, and you can watch it. And the shape that happens, if you actually watch the bubbles going around, which you have to do on a time lapse, is the exact same shape as the magnetic field of the Earth. So when I started to see this, I started to think, wow, like all of these patterns are actually really interconnected. The way that things work are actually quite basic if we start to make the connections ourselves. Next slide. So these are some examples of fermented food. Beer, sourdough bread, yogurt, cheese, vinegar, wine, soy sauce, kombucha, chocolate, spirits. And nowadays there's like a million lacto-fermented vegetables that are also available. These are pretty common products, and the list is much, 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 much longer. But I just wanted to use some of the common ones that people would know. The interesting thing about bread is that what we did with bread is we moved from making a sourdough starter, which is basically you take flour and then you mix it with water. You make sure that it's mixed in very nicely, cover it with a cloth, and then you just leave that to do its thing. Come back, feed it again, and then it will start to ferment. Once it's active, you can use that to leaven your bread so that your bread rises. But because we're also impatient and hungry, we decided to work on this dry yeast product. What dry yeast does is it hastens that leavening process so that you can much more quickly rise your bread, and then you can also have more consistent results with a bit less labor around feeding and caring for your starter. But what that's done is now we have this explosion of people who have gluten intolerance or issues with digesting bread, right? And basically what the sourdough starter is doing is digesting a lot of those complex carbohydrates for you ahead of time, so that by the time you eat that bread, it's much more easily digestible. So the thing about gluten intolerance and wheat is also that wheat is like a grain like this, which has a bunch of different parts to it. But what we do is we remove all of the fibrous and nutritionally dense parts, and we're left with the one that's white, refinable, easy to work with, and monotonous. Yeah, we remove the casing on the outside, and we're left with this tiny little part on the inside, and that's what we're farming wheat for. And because of that, also, we don't get as many nutrients from bread as we used to in the past. Bread used to be, there's a reason that so many people have it as a staple food, but nowadays it's really known as an empty food unless it's created in a proper way. Also, an issue with wheat is the glyphosate, which is one of the worst chemical compounds in farming, in the industrial agriculture. You can almost be certain that this compound will be found in the biggest crops. So maize, rice, wheat, things like that. This is also impacting this huge spread of gluten intolerance, which is happening all over the world. All right, next slide. So this is the word culture. So culture always comes up when you're talking about fermentation. When you make boucher, do you use a bit of the previous boucher to ferment the next boucher, or do you buy a separate malt?
Yes. The Monday.
Or you make
You let the millet germinate, and then you use that.
Okay, perfect. Because people do it in all different types of ways, actually. I was reading about it yesterday. So the interesting thing about fermentation is it's useful to have for most fermentations, a batch from the previous culture to inoculate this culture. So say when you're making kombucha, for example, kombucha is essentially sweet tea, water, sugar, and the bacterial SCOBY, which sits on top. But you need a bit of the previous batch of kombucha to now inoculate this kombucha.
That's true.
Gives it a protective pH, and also I like to think about this in terms of continuity. Like, culture is made up of bits and pieces of previous parts of culture that we move forward with each time. So fermentation relates to culture in many different types of ways. So we just talked about the starter culture. If you have a bunch of different ferments in your house, like you have a cabbage ferment here, you have a kombucha ferment here, there's a chance that they can cross-culture and create something new. Usually that something new will not be tasty and it will smell off. But also this is another interesting thing. Many people, when they're approaching fermentation, they think, oh, can I do it? Am I going to do it wrong? Am I going to poison myself? And what you don't realize is, if you open a bad batch, your body will tell you, do not eat that. You will see mold, you will smell something off. Yeah. So it's really what I love so much about this book is it's not like a recipe book. It's not, this is how we make things. It's more why, and it's more encouraging people just to try and to just give you the tools to understand the things you need to pay attention to, and then to accept that this is a natural thing that we do. You're welcome to try. Yeah? Okay. So culture actually comes from the Latin word cultura, which is a form of colere, which means cultivate. And I like this understanding of the word, because here in culture we have now, we're talking about culture in regards to fermentation. We're also talking about culture with regards to soil and us being a part of that soil. So everything is actually connected. Okay, next slide. So living food. The same way I gave the example of customers not really wanting to see that you make things yourself or wanting to see that everything comes from a factory. People are not so excited about the concept of living food. If you go to the supermarket, the majority of the things that you will find in there have additives, have preservatives, have been pasteurized, and any of the life that came with that food can be like confirmed that it's gone. Yeah. So I think what's interesting about this is that now we have this whole fear dynamic when it comes to eating and around food. Like, oh, if something is alive, I'm not sure if I want to interact with that. But I know that a soda, if I drink a soda, I'm going to feel just fine now. So better the devil I know, and I can just drink it, and maybe I'll worry about this in 7 years' time. Like prolong the problem. We had a huge challenge in Tanzania introducing kombucha to the market, because kombucha is quite like the first time you drink kombucha, you kind of go like this. It's a bit acidic, it's funky, it's got all these random notes, and if you're not used to that and you're used to sukari, then you might be, that's a bit strange. So we had a really huge problem because in Tanzania I can't buy just any kind of juice anywhere. It's got 70 spoons of sugar inside. People love sugar. So it's been a really interesting thing. We had to actually adjust our kombucha to ferment it just a little bit less, so it was slightly less acidic for our market. When we ferment at home, we ferment it a bit longer, so it's a bit more dry. But in Tanzania, there's really no option. People like sugar. So we made it a little bit more on the sweet side, and now I see that people start to appreciate this balance between sweet and sour. Okay, so supermarkets are basically emptying food of its actual values to fill pockets, to make sure that they can sell it so it can stay on the shelf for longer. We don't pasteurize our kombucha or any of our products. Everything is living and everything is raw. What that means is that they have really short shelf dates, expiry dates and shelf life. So we always get people calling us, oh, this expired, and we exchange it to them for free. Because we know it's a new thing. We really want to provide people with an authentic, healthy choice. And if we now start getting into, oh, should we pasteurize, should we put this in it, then what are you doing? You might as well be a soda. So we really find this to be important, but we also find it interesting that supermarkets and stores, they don't want to stop you if you have a short shelf life. They want you to pasteurize. They want to know that you're going through all of those processes to remove the nutrients from the product.
I would love to ask, do you have your own supply spaces?
Yeah. How do you mean supply spaces?
Yeah, like as a supermarket, and then when you get it in a supermarket, do you have your own spaces where you supply your product?
So we sell in supermarkets, restaurants, delis, places like this, and usually what we do is we actually give our customers a glass front mini fridge. We try and make a nice display for it, because you can otherwise be guaranteed that someone is going to put that delivery on the floor, and it's going to stay there, and it's going to keep fermenting, and then they'll realize, oh, I should put that in the fridge. So we actually try and control this by giving our customers a fridge. Another example of this actually is eating lentils or sprouts. Lentils and beans, you usually soak them before you cook them, right?
Yes.
And there's a reason behind that. I remember one time someone soaked the beans, and then they cooked the beans in the same water that they soaked them in. And my dad was outraged. He was like, I can taste it! I just thought that was so funny. Soaking or germinating beans is supposed to help, because the legumes are supposed to have a little bit too much folate. So to help reduce that, make them look more digestible. But I just found it so funny that he really had 1 spoon of beans. And I was like, I'm sorry. And then I spoke to you a little bit about our troubles commercializing kombucha and how people really just want to have an empty product and they don't want to have living food. At least for our market. Who knows? I think Uganda would be different. But I would like for us to stop and think about that concept for a moment, like living food. Yeah? So it doesn't have to mean that the product is still fermenting, but it does mean, there's a lot of people who are encouraging these days that when you pick the fruit from a tree, as long as you don't live in a place which has a lot of acid rain, or it's on the corner, that you should not wash it, because actually a lot of the yeasts and the microbes that are living on that skin are going to feed you so much more for your gut microbiome. So this is also living food. Yeah? Just think about that. You can write some notes if you want. Next slide. So this is just a little bit, I don't want to go too much into it because actually I realize it's not so relevant for you, but fermentation has a bunch of health benefits, as well as a bunch of benefits for your mental health and social cohesion and community. So there's a lot of research now about the gut-brain axis because essentially what's happening is that having a more robust microbiome there's a lot of links between that and better mental health. There's a lot of links between people who experience brain fog or depression or issues like this that start to adjust their diet by, just having a side of kimchi or drinking bushera in the afternoon or something like this. And there's a lot of research that suggests that this is really improving people's mental state of health as well. Next slide. So we spoke already about recipes as being passed down through family connections. Nowadays you use cookbooks, YouTube videos, Instagram reels, everything like this. One thing that I find quite interesting is reading between the lines in a recipe because, when you speak to grandmas, for example, they never measure anything. They do everything by the eye, and they have this general knack for how food works. My husband's mother, she doesn't even believe in having a scale in the house. She's like, we do things by the eye, and we know. Okay. So, what's interesting about this is that you kind of get to learn the broader things about the recipe and how to make sense of the instructions you've been given. So, say for example, if you're going to cook pumpkin leaves, you know that you need to go and remove the fiber from the middle.
Yeah.
Same with matembele, sweet potato leaves and things like this. And someone has told you that you need to do that because if you eat it, it's going to be really stringy and it's going to, it won't be an enjoyable thing to eat. The same thing with dough. When you're working with dough, people generally, you won't see it much in the old recipe books, but it will be people who transmit this information like, always keep it covered, don't have the fan on, make sure that it's a damp cloth, or, there's reading between the lines of the recipe books also. Same thing goes for how we garden, actually. If you look at older gardening books, they'll be really rigid in the instructions, and only now we've started to put in information like why we do things the way that we do. So when you're pruning a fruit tree, you're not just pruning it to harvest it so that you have the maximum amount of fruit, you're also pruning it so that you're letting in as much light for the young leaves as possible so that all of them are exposed to sun and can grow. So the instructions, I think these days are getting a little bit more, they're including all of those invisible tricks that we used to have handed down to us. What I find really interesting is that in Korea, both north and south, they differentiate between tongue taste, which is molecules making contact and flavor profiles in your mouth, and hand taste, which is the taste of food which has been made by you or someone that you love with some level of intention. So I think that this is really, really fantastic to think about. Tongue taste is just, okay, I go for pizza and, cheese matches with this, and okay, cool, I feel like that tastes good. And then there's hand taste, and again, like when you make your own bread or when you make something, a dish for yourself and you're super happy with it and it goes down, it really goes down. So in this way, I think recipes invite creativity and play into our lives because there are some practical instructions around how high the heat should be. If you burn the onions, the sauce will be bitter, or, there are those things to consider, but there is a lot of experimentation that can be done there, right? And that's how we create new food cultures. Okay, next slide. Okay, so kimchi is on the UNESCO list of cultural heritage foods, like Belgian beer, which I found really funny. Apparently in Belgium they used to give their kids beer in the Victorian age because the water was so contaminated, so it was safer to give the children light food. So kimchi is like a massive, massive, massive part of both North and South Korean culture. People get together in ridiculous numbers to prepare this. We also make kimchi in with our company, HumanKind. Every single time we make kimchi, it's like you have 200 kilograms of cabbage, Napa cabbage in front of you. Everybody's like ready for war. You have a full day of cutting and baking and pasting, and in Korea then you will leave your kimchi in these clay pots and they will ferment in there. So this will be at the end of the growing season of the cabbage when everything's been harvested. In the autumn time, everybody comes together, makes this super spicy paste, and there's variations with each region. There's variations with what you can use. Some people make pak choy, kimchi, cucumber kimchi. There's like hundreds. Actually, most homes in South Korea have a food fridge and a kimchi fridge because they use kimchi as a side with almost every meal, from the morning to the evening. And so these clay pots, you can find rolling hills of these mass kimchi production, but prepared by people, which is really lovely. It's a communal activity, it's a festive event, and people really enjoy making it. Depending on the temperature, again, this recipe can be ready in 3 days, up to 2 weeks. All that's going to happen is the sugar is going to get fermented out of it, and it's just going to get more and more bitter. But some people like that. I wanted to talk, next slide please. I wanted to talk a little bit about this dish. It comes from very far away. It's a Polish dish, and I know this through my mother-in-law. But I think it's relevant to talk about because it's super seasonal, and it's my husband's favorite meal. And he's eaten it in many different places at very great restaurants, and just basically no one makes it like his mom. So it's called barszcz czerwony łyżkami. And you see those mushrooms at the top in the corner. Those are all forest mushrooms. So around September, when you start to get like the autumn coming through and some thaw on the ground, forest mushrooms start to grow, and it's a big, very big part of Polish culture. They know which ones to pick, which ones not to pick, and it's usually your grandparent who will take you out into the forest and will teach you about the mushrooms while your parents go and enjoy them. Also, what's interesting about this meal is that at the same time of year, the beetroot is being harvested and fermented, and that's what makes the base of this. Oh, you can't really see it, but it's a very pink soup. You can see it here, actually. It's like hot pink. So you make a bit of fermented beetroot, and then you put your forest mushrooms. And you cook your forest mushrooms up with some onion and some garlic and chop them into small pieces, and you make a dough. And usually they'll have a variation of different types of grain that they use. There'll be a little bit of whole wheat, a little bit of white flour, sometimes some rice to make the dough for the tiny, tiny dumpling. And then basically what happens is before Christmas time, they'll prepare the food ahead of time. So families come together, everybody's already been mushroom foraging, they've been fermenting their beetroots, and then there'll be a huge table out, and they'll roll this impossibly sized piece of dough. And then my mother-in-law will go with a shot glass and make tiny little cuttings in that piece of dough, fill it with a quarter of a teaspoon with the mushroom filling, and make a dumpling about this size. And she spends about 3 days doing that. And this is basically what everybody eats for Christmas, and it's a really, really treasured meal. Everybody's got really fond memories of this dish. So what I find really interesting about this is my generation, they will not make this dish. There's very few people who, in the younger years, even my husband's sister, who is older, they will not make this dish. They'll be like, go to the shop and buy this dish. I don't love you enough to make that dish. There's so much work. So there's a lot of, the labor of love involved, the ritual around what they call Vigilia, which is their Christmas. And yeah, I just find this really fascinating, this dish. All right, next one. Okay, so we talked a little bit yesterday in Patrick's workshop about the globalization because of the homogenization of seed, globalization of food through trade, and what that means for people's diets. Like we actually have less diversity in the areas, globally we have more diversity, but locally we have more diversity, but globally we have less, because each area's food culture has been influenced by all the other food cultures in the world, and the access to those ingredients is changing the food cultures quickly. So I think it's interesting to reflect on this whole global-local conversation when it comes to food, because of course we love that we can buy things that have come from far away, that are a little bit different. You don't have to live next to the sea to eat prawns, for example, and it is a positive thing, which again started with good intentions, but it kind of meant that the foods that we do have locally available we pay less attention to, and we give less creative practice to investigating through recipe production. Okay, so this is basically just to talk a little bit about sharing cultures. So in fermentation, you have, in kombucha you have the SCOBY, or sometimes you have the sourdough starter, or a little bit of liquid from the batch of beetroot ferment that you made, and this is your starter culture. And these starter cultures have spread all across the world. We were just talking with Patrick about where they initially came from, and it's hard to say where did the first kombucha SCOBY come from, chicken and the egg, yeah? Because essentially maybe there's a lot of speculation that it originated in China. It's possible that someone made a pot of sweet tea, left it on the side, a specific kind of insect came to investigate what that is, interacted with the tea, left, and then it was inoculated and the pellicle started to grow. And I was also sharing with Patrick that when you make yogurt, ants, when they're burrowing and digging, and they bring up all this earth, you can take that earth and you can use that to make yogurt. It can be the starter culture for yogurt. Nice. It's an inoculant. So, it's hard to say where all of these things come from, but these cultures have really traveled all over the world. And one thing that I do...
Sorry, I was just I wanted to know where SCOBY as a word comes from.
Good point. So SCOBY means symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. So it's partially bacteria and it's partially yeast. Kombucha is super interesting because it has a two-part fermentation. So the sugars and the tannins in the sweet tea mixture are feeding the yeast. The yeast are creating ethanol and carbon dioxide. The bacteria are eating that ethanol and turning it into acetic acid bacteria. By the time the yeast have also absorbed the oxygen, because you need to have a cloth cover so that it can breathe, then it starts to grow the pellicle, which is the SCOBY, and that covers so that the whole batch is now submerged and it's anaerobic. Yeah, so this is like the protective layer, which is also the culture. Does anybody know what a SCOBY looks like?
Yeah.
How would you describe it?
It's like a yellowish plastic. It's like almost plastic, but then it's like jello. Yeah, basically.
Some people call it a mushroom. Some people call it a fungus. We work with one man called Babu Ali who calls it Lulu, and it's very strange. It does look rubbery, plastic, but it's definitely natural material, and it's also very hard. People have started making vegan leather out of SCOBYs. People have started making vegan dog treat out of SCOBYs. The list is getting long. So what's interesting about, what I find nice about globalization is that we can share these cultures, and then you can utilize those cultures with the ingredients that you have locally available to you in your area. So say, for example, if I give you a starter culture for sourdough, which is using rye flour from Ukraine, and then you decide to feed it with the flour that you've grown locally, you're cross-culturing, but you're also making a really, really nutrient-dense new blend of something that you could use to make your own ferment. So this is really, really quite fun. Okay. So and then this part here was just sharing again that this was a quote that I saw. A cheap and uniform product mass-produced under sanitary conditions is taken as unequivocally superior to the traditional village-produced product, regardless of the cultural and economic importance of the practice in the village context. So I guess what I thought was relevant about this quote was just that we've given so much of that manual work, that contact work, that touch, that feel, that getting to know the actual material of the subject away to industrial food systems, that we've really lost that bridge of understanding it ourselves. And a part of being able to conserve our biodiversity is knowing what to do with it, knowing how to work with it, and the more creative we can be about the food that we put together and the food that we share with people, I think the more chance there is for each of those food types to continue a long lineage. Okay, next slide. Okay, I went to a conference a couple of years ago called the Oxford Real Farming Conference, which is about people who are trying to put these regenerative farming systems into place, and a few different projects that are happening across the world. And there's a lady that I met there called Vivian Sansur. She has a project called the Palestinian Heirloom Seed Library, and it's one of the best projects I've ever met. So what she's basically trying to do is to document and archive seeds, but also to exchange them. And she's shared Palestinian, like indigenous Palestinian seeds with people all over the world who are growing them in urban gardens, who are growing them in systems which are built on, sometimes you'll have a farm, monoculture, which is just one type of plant, and then other times you'll have a farm which is agroecological structure. So it's different types of plants next to each other which support each other, increase resilience, and you'll find a lot of her seeds in farms like that. And she has another project called the Traveling Kitchen, where when they grow those products, they go to different areas, they talk to people about the seeds themselves and about where they come from and why the culture is dying around keeping these alive. And obviously, considering what's happening today in Palestine, this is extremely relevant. If you're to think about your indigenous seed as your right to your own indigenous genetic material, because if we're only buying food from places who have genetically modified seeds to not even resemble first of all, it doesn't resemble the type of diversity that used to be available, and also it doesn't resemble what the plant used to look like, the resilience that it used to have, the characteristics that it used to have to be able to, fight with nature's surprises. So now it makes so much more sense for projects like this, because, in Ukraine during the war, they bombed the national seed vault. So all of this archived information about seeds within the Ukraine is officially gone. And on the market in Ukraine now, all you can buy is seeds which will produce a variety which produces seeds which are sterile. So it's one-time use.
Yeah.
So a lot of the time you'll have to go back to the shop, even for flowers, just to have flowers growing in your garden. So now what people in Ukraine have started doing during the war is they start exchanging these heirloom seeds and keeping them alive in their gardens, because if you think about the Palestinian heirloom seed library in comparison to this seed vault in Ukraine, naturally it's something that is also in the process of growth and decay. So if you take it to a vault and you freeze it and you keep it there, okay, fine, you've got an archive, but it's a living thing. So for it to be a library involves it growing in different soils, experiencing different climates, being looked after by different gardeners, but in that way it kind of grows and it makes itself move. Next slide. So this is a quote from the lady who started that, and I'll just read it for you. So, sharing seeds can forge strong cross-cultural bonds and simultaneously hold us accountable for historical wrongs and current atrocities. Seeds are the embodiments of erasure and loss, as well as the dream and possibility of survival. Vivian, so that was the person who is running the Seed Co, who works with heirloom seeds in the States. Vivian through Seeds has the rare ability to hold these elements of loss and hope in a tender balance. I got an email from folks in Gaza asking me what to eat in the wild right now, like what could be growing outside that we can eat because we are starving. That email made me cry, not only because they're starving, but also because it made me understand how the work that we've been trying to do is so urgent. Reconnecting to heirloom seeds, which can also be called indigenous seeds, is also about trying to preserve cultural knowledge about food that's already growing wild, both in a time of crisis and with the dream that someday it could be enjoyed in a time of thriving as well. Every time we plant a seed or we plant a tree, we are planting it with the hope and the intention to have a future. I thought that was really nice to share. Next slide, and then next slide actually. So this is the point where we're supposed to be going? Okay. So
No, we can make.
we can make? So then just give me 5 minutes to grab the stuff from the kitchen. But is everybody okay with getting their hands dirty, or certain people would like to and others would not? There's no problem.
Do I get to eat some carrots?
You can eat carrots. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to make sauerkraut. I split you up into groups of 4 because otherwise everybody would have a chopping board and packing. And you can take it in turns amongst your group to prepare the vegetables for the ferment. Basically what we do when we make sauerkraut is we get this cabbage, regular, normal, not so special and not as special indigenous greens cabbage. And then any impurities, like if you see that it's been eaten into by a doo-doo, if you see that it's been starting to wilt, then you can just start to remove the outer leaves, how you would usually do when you cook it, and you can put those to the side. I'll get a bag so you can put them out. And if you have a bit that's going inside like this, you can just cut that off, okay? Then what we usually do is we cut the cabbage in half, and we lay it flat on the chopping board, and we start to cut slices. The slices can be as big as you like. If you like crunchy things, bigger slices. If you like more thin pieces and it's a bit more, you can taste the lactic acid and it's more juicy, then do smaller pieces. We also have here some carrots, which work very well with cabbage when you ferment it. So you can take off the skin. They are organic, but I would take off the skin anyway, just because I see a lot of soil in here and it might contaminate the batch. And then either you can, I have a grater, you can grate or you can cut in chunks, and then we'll mix it all in together in the end. Well, the important thing to do for now, keep the carrots on one side and the cabbage on another side. Because once we finish to slice the cabbage, we're going to mix some salt in it. The salt is going to help to break down the fibers of the cabbage, and we're going to squeeze it until it's soft enough to start the fermentation process, until liquid is coming out from the cabbage, so that we have enough to submerge it in the liquid. Okay? All right, so first things first, whoever's going to cut, please go and wash your hands. With salt. Can I borrow yours? Okay. So we're having a look at the cabbage. Remember about removing anything that looks a little bit off. Wow, it feels really nice to be fermenting without gloves.
Until the internet sees it.
Don't tell them. And then you just want to half the cabbage down the middle. Usually at this point you'll get a pretty good idea of how fresh the cabbage is. This one is organic, but it doesn't look so happy. I'm sure why. All right. Usually with cabbage you just have like this combination of color, texture, and the amount of water that comes out when you cut it. You know when you cut into a pumpkin and it's like just water. Yeah. Then you look at it like, no, when you cut a pumpkin, and it's water, it looks like it's sweating. It's usually a really delicious pumpkin. Yeah. You know? So they have these like signs of life. So I like mine juicy, so I cut really thin like that. Okay? Like this. So basically once you've halved it like that, then it will be able to break up into smaller pieces. Okay? If you like a crunch, feel free to go for bigger pieces. It's no problem. All right. So there's 4 basins here for the 4 groups. I'd say if everybody starts with the cabbage, then we can go on to the other veggies next. I'm oscillating, so if you need anything, let me know.
What is oscillating?
What I wanted to show you today was the basics of an easy sauerkraut, and from then, you know, I would really recommend, I would probably leave this book, The Art of Fermentation, here in the library, and I would really recommend having a look at some of the recipes because it's endless. Once you start, you basically won't stop. There's so many possibilities and flavors, and it's really fun. Cabbage is cut. There's a little bit you need to know about ratios. So what's going to break down the cabbage and start the fermentation process and also protect it from unwanted molds and bacteria when it's starting the fermentation process is salt. Yeah. You asked a great question, which is why I'm not using iodized salt. In fact, you can use regular table salt, but with really inconsistent results. the understanding is that either pink salt or any kind of mineral salt is much better at activating the fermentation and breaking up the fiber in the cabbage. So what you want to do at this stage, everybody can get a bowl, well, 3 people can get a bowl in front of them, and you just want to lightly mix the ingredients so that everything's a bit more uniform. You'll find that there's some big pieces like this, they might be tasty later, doesn't have to be uniform. Do you want a bit more in yours?
Some more carrots.
Some more general load. You okay? Okay. Either way, this is the best part of the process. It involves a lot of massaging. Do you mind pass me a paper tissue? So, the amount of salt that you use needs to be between roughly 1.8 and 3% of the weight of the cabbage for it to be safe. If you between 1.8 and 3% of the weight of the cabbage. So I purchased 9 kilograms of cabbage. I left 1 for Gracie. So let's say we have, sorry, I purchased 10 kilos. I left 1 kilo for Gracie. So let's say we're working with 9 kilograms of cabbage now, yeah? So what we want to do is we want to work out 1.8% of that 9 kilograms. But we have to calculate it in grams, otherwise we won't get the right proportion. So what that works out as is about 54 grams, if we split that into 4, of salt per bowl. So the bowls are not entirely equal, but we shall survive. Okay, it doesn't need to be as specific for the demonstration. All right, so also if you don't have a measuring scale at home, you can always Google what is the weight of, what amount of mineral salt goes in 1 tablespoon, and then you'll get an amount in grams, and then you can use the tablespoon. So that's what I just did, and 54 grams each, it should be, okay? You might need a little bit of cabbage from me.
Okay.
Here. Your hand's still clean? Okay, so I'll do this one. So 54 grams is 3 tablespoons. So that's 3 tablespoons per bucket.
So 3.
3. Try and make it like a level, yeah. So all the extra ingredients that you have, if you choose to use onion or garlic or red pepper or green pepper or whatever, you would mix in after you've done the salt and mixing and squeezing the cabbage. So once you have the salt, you can start to mix it, but as you mix, try to squeeze. Yeah, so like blend and squeeze. So we do this with 200-300 kilograms of cabbage, and we separate it into big buckets. Traditionally, they used to do it in wooden buckets, and you would use your feet, and kind of like with wine. But now nobody trusts feet anymore. Should I do for you the song? And then you can start the massage.
I don't think about it.
So now just to release some water. Yeah.
That's the problem.
I've done it before. Anyone wants to squeeze cabbage with you?
Yeah, I would suggest do a bit, then you can pass it around because the buckets are a little smaller. Otherwise, we would be here for quite a lot of time processing cabbage. Sorry in advance.
How do you know when the cabbage is ready?
Oh, another great question. So with the cabbage, depending on the temperature, some places it takes a few days. In Zanzibar, for example, it takes 4 days, but that's really on the short side. A lot of places it takes about around 1 week. The best thing you can do is to taste it as it ferments, to feel how it's developing. You will get this response from your brain body which tells you, sweet spot. And then you know it's ready. Yes, this one is really ready.
How long because I don't know how long they can keep in.
So basically, if you pack it into a jar and it's submerged with liquid, what I would suggest is once you have this jar, you then, once that's ready, you want to move that into a few smaller jars. Because what happens is when you pack those jars, you want to refrigerate. Because if you open the jar, it's a living food, oxygen will enter the jar and it will continue to ferment. But if you close the jar and you keep it sealed, and the reason I say to use a few jars is so that you can open one for one meal and not have to worry about, using it again. But it can keep for about 2 to 3 days after you've opened it, each jar. Okay, so I think you're definitely good to start packing. What you want to do at this stage, once your cabbage has gone soft and you've got quite a lot of water, is you want to add whichever other ingredients you want to involve in the fermentation. So you want some coriander, some beetroot, some spring onions. Let me see.
There's already some that's not fermented.
Once the cabbage is ready and mixed and everything is good, you can pour it into jars. What I would suggest is packing it in a smaller amounts and then compacting with your fist. So you put like 2 handfuls and push it down with your fist. Another 2 handfuls, push it down with your fist. So once you finish to push down on the cabbage, once you've got all of it from the basin into the jar, you just want to take a serviette and just wipe around the mouth so that it's totally dry, the mouth of the jar. That's going to go inside. So all of the water which you have left in the basin goes in with the cabbage. The space doesn't make too much of a difference. What's just important is that the cabbage is submerged. So usually how people do that is they'll boil like some big river stones and then put those in the jar, but they're a little bit difficult to get in and out. Alternatively, you can have something which is called a fermentation weight, but those are actually really expensive and specific to the jar size. So what we do at my company is we fill a glass bottle with water, and then we use the bottle to push down the cabbage. But what we're going to do today is we're going to fill a food bag with water, and then we're going to leave that inside the jar, and then we'll cover it with the cloth. But for now, I think if everybody just wipes around the sides to make sure it's clean and nice and dry, because generally any bad bacteria that's going to want to penetrate your batch is going to make its entry at the mouth. So bacteria love warm and moist places, so just think dry mouth of the jar. Super. So if you don't weigh it down and you don't keep it in the liquid, everything will come up and you'll see it starts to discolor, it will start to grow some funny molds, and that will not be good. When you weigh it down and submerge it in the liquid, you can see these guys here, they've actually got quite a lot of liquid there as well. Then it will come with, they also have the most amount of cabbage. But either way, we'll submerge it again. But one thing I just wanted to show you is like how pretty they are. When you look at it from the side of the jar, you get to see the vegetables interacting with each other. Tomorrow when you see it, you'll see the bubbles starting to form and there's movement happening in the jar. if you made it, maybe you want to put in masking tape or sticky note with your name so that you can know it will look different tomorrow. And another important thing is that every day in the fermentation process, you assist the process by opening the jar, taking out the waste, and pushing it down again. So I would do that if it was at home. I would do that 2 or 3 times a day. But even with one,
Okay.
oh, that color is so nice. A little bit of love and nurture later, and then it's ready. That's it. Other ferments are much more complicated, but sauerkraut and vegetables are very easy.
Orange green.
Orange. Cool, we done.